The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War was one of the bloodiest and most defining events in the history of the United States. Fought between 1861 and 1865, it wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a clash of ideals, economies, and visions for the future of the nation. Today, we'll explore why it happened, what major events shaped it, and how it changed America. In the early 19th century, America was deeply divided. The northern states had developed into an industrial economy with factories, railroads, and growing cities. The southern states, on the other hand, depended heavily on agriculture, especially cotton, and relied on enslaved labor to keep that system alive. As the country expanded westward, a burning question emerged. Would new states allow slavery, or would this debate grew more intense after the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which both tried to balance the interests of free and slave states, but ultimately fueled more. By the 1850s, the nation was on edge. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that enslaved people had no rights as citizens, further enraging the North. And in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Although Lincoln promised not to abolish slavery immediately, Southern leaders saw his victory as a threat to their way of life. Within months, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The war officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. At first, many believed the conflict would be short, but soon, the scale of the war became clear. In 1861, the First Battle of Bull Run shocked both sides with its violence. In 1862, battles like Shiloh and Antietam showed the war would be long. Antietam, in particular, was the single bloodiest day in American history, with over 22,000 casualties. Leaders emerged on both sides. For the Union, generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. For the Confederacy, the legendary Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Each side believed it was fighting for survival, one to preserve the Union, the other to defend its independence and social order. A major turning point came in 1863. After the Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, momentum shifted. That same year, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. This transformed the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It became a fight for human freedom. The proclamation also discouraged foreign nations like Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy. General Grant pushed deep into Southern territory, while Sherman's march to the sea devastated the Confederacy's infrastructure and morale. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Just days later, tragedy struck when President Lincoln was assassinated, leaving the nation to mourn even as the war ended. The Civil War left America forever changed. Over 600,000 soldiers died, more than in any other U.S. conflict. Slavery was abolished, but the struggle for equality was far from over. The war also reinforced the power of the federal government and paved the way for the United States to grow into a modern nation. Even today, the Civil War continues to shape American culture, politics, and memory. It was a tragedy, but also a turning point, a test of the nation's ideals of liberty and unity. The American Civil War was more than just a fight between North and South. It was the battle that determined what kind of country the United States would become. Why did the Civil War really start? The Civil War didn't erupt out of nowhere. The central issue was slavery, but it was tied to deeper economic, social, and political conflicts. For decades, the United States had been divided between the industrial North and the agricultural South. The North relied on factories, railroads, and cities, and most people there opposed slavery, often seeing it as a moral wrong. The South, however, depended on large plantations that required enslaved labor, and many Southerners saw slavery as an essential way of life. The conflict intensified as the United States expanded westward. Each new territory raised the question, would it permit slavery or not? Compromises like the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act tried to keep balance, but only fueled tensions. Then came the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled that enslaved people were property, not citizens. This outraged the North while emboldening the South. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery,
Southern states felt threatened and began seceding from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. That
Who were
secession
the main
was the
leaders of the
spark. In the
war?
North, Union, the key political leader was President Abraham Lincoln, who was determined to preserve the Union at all costs. Militarily, the Union's most prominent generals were Ulysses S. Grant, who eventually became the top commander and later President of the United States, and William Tecumseh Sherman, known for his brutal but effective March to the Sea. In the South, Confederacy, Jefferson Davis served as president, while the legendary General Robert E. Lee commanded the Confederate Army. Lee is often considered one of the most talented military leaders in American history. Other notable Confederate generals included Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who earned his nickname for his firm stand in battle. These leaders' decisions shaped the course of the war, its length, and ultimately its outcome.
What were the bloodiest battles of the Civil War?
The Civil War was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. In 1862, the Battle of Antietam became the single bloodiest day in U.S. history, with over 22,000 casualties in just one day. In July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg marked the largest battle ever fought on American soil. It ended in a Union victory, stopped Lee's invasion of the North, and became a turning point in the war. Around the same time, the Union captured Vicksburg, gaining control of the Mississippi River and cutting the Confederacy in two. By the end of the war, more than 600,000 soldiers had died, a staggering toll that reshaped the nation. Q4. How did Abraham Lincoln change the course of the war? At first, Lincoln's primary goal was preserving the Union. But as the war dragged on, he realized slavery was at the heart of the conflict. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. This didn't immediately free all enslaved people, but it shifted the war's purpose. It was no longer just about unity. It was about freedom. It also allowed nearly 200,000 African American soldiers to join the Union Army, strengthening its forces. Lincoln's speeches, especially the Gettysburg Address, reframed the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
How did the Civil War end?
By 1865, the South was exhausted. The Union's industrial strength and larger population gave it a decisive advantage. General Grant pressed Lee's forces in Virginia, while Sherman destroyed Southern infrastructure during his march across Georgia. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, effectively ending the war. Just days later, tragedy struck. President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Washington, shocking a nation that was just beginning to heal. What happened after the war?
After the Civil War, the United States entered the challenging period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. But the road was rough. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized freedmen, and Southern states passed restrictive black codes. Although schools and infrastructure were built and federal troops enforced new rights, resistance was strong. By 1877, federal troops withdrew, and Southern states reasserted control, ushering in an era of segregation and racial discrimination that lasted nearly a century. Still, the Reconstruction Amendments laid the foundation for future.
Why does the Civil War still matter?
The Civil War wasn't just a conflict of the past, it fundamentally shaped modern America. It ended slavery, preserved the Union, and tested whether a democracy built on liberty could survive deep division. Questions of equality, citizenship, and the power of government that the war raised are still relevant. Debates over civil rights, national identity, and racial justice all trace back to the Civil War era. The war remains a reminder of the enormous sacrifices made and the ongoing struggle to fulfill America's founding promise of liberty and justice